Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be introduced by a Johnny Cash fan and to join this august panel and this interesting conference. I'm really happy to get a chance to chat with you. I am going to compare today philanthropy to other sectors of American society with which it overlaps and sometimes competes. Because in the US, we have three distinct ways of solving social problems: through the government, obviously, almost all societies do that; through commercial mechanisms of business, which is done much more often here than in most other countries; and also through charitable action, which is done way more often here than in any other country in the world. Now, these three approaches are generally very different, and the one that gets the least credit by far is philanthropy, and I'm going to try to change your view on that today. The function of the state, I think, is pretty obvious when it comes to solving problems, so I'm not going to dwell on that. People talk about that all the time. And in addition, businesses are claiming a large and growing role in fulfilling public needs, as I mentioned. Many tasks that used to be handled by government are now been taken on more effectively by companies. What's much less often recognized is that there is this third sector with potent capacities for solving societal problems. And sometimes we call this third sector civil society, or the independent sector, you will hear sometimes, or of course philanthropy and voluntary action. And the institutions of this independent sector, they don't wield the commanding authority of the state, and they don't enjoy the profit incentives of the commercial sector that give it its power, and yet they can be highly effective. In fact, there are many areas where neither power nor money will do you much good. And these include many of today's most urgent afflictions. We worry about, you've got your own list, but mine would be things like disturbed children and the very fast rising suicide rate. And I don't know if you realize, lifespans in America on average are now in decline. Unprecedented problem. There's squalid street populations in lots of cities today. There's declining participation in work by middle-aged males. Those kinds of problems have roots. The real roots of those symptoms are things like family breakdown, which Frank talked about, and addiction, and declining faith, and rising depression. Those are our most dangerous problems today, right? Not trade problems or all the other stuff that dominates the newspapers. Those deeper issues are far more dangerous to our society. And folks, you cannot reverse those kinds of problems through legislation or through police powers or through government payments. And you also can't buy a fix from a market vendor. Those kinds of problems, though, family breakdown, depression, loss of faith, they do respond to personal interventions, right? Emotional connection and neighborly encouragement and sympathy, and religious knowledge and local experience. Those kinds of tools, which of course charities specialize in, are often able to make a difference where impersonal institutions achieve absolutely nothing. And this isn't just some philosophical point I'm arguing, folks. This 1,342-page book you're looking at here that I wrote a few years ago is packed with thousands of very specific examples of how philanthropy is able to succeed in sectors where state authority and commercial inventiveness fail. It's really important to understand that charitable work is a lot more than, soup kitchens and children's clubs and the things you quickly think of. Philanthropy is actually a mechanism for tackling very serious, large-scale social needs. And I'll just give you a couple tiny examples of that to try to pull you away from the more conventional views of philanthropy. For instance, I don't know if you're aware that the two greatest public amenities in New York City, which I would say are the New York Public Library, you see here, and Central Park, they are not run by government folks. They are not under the purview of the mayor. They are operated entirely by charities. The New York Public Library is not only the most used research library in the world, but it is also the largest provider in our most populous city of English classes, of citizenship instruction, of free legal services, of computer training, of pre-K literacy, and lots of other popular needs. And right from the day of its founding, 125 years ago, right up to this present moment, the New York Public Library has always been a private charity powered by donors. I don't know if you can see carved on the facade there is the names of the three different foundations that came together to form the library. Or consider Central Park. Now, it did used to be an agency of government, and they ran it right into the ground. When I was in college, Central Park was a great place to go get mugged, and not much else. Many of you will remember the great, what are they called? The Great Lawn turned into a dust bowl, all the grass died. Belvedere Castle was ringed with razor wire and covered with graffiti. I have a very vivid image in my mind of this. The Bethesda fountain, the beautiful fountain, was broken. There was at one point, I remember, there's a famous statue called the Falconer with a man with a bird on his arm. Some thief climbed up on the statue and sawed off the bird at one point. The place was just a complete mess. And this had a serious quality of life problem for New York City families. You need a place to recreate if you are living with a family in a city. What happened was a group of donors finally got disgusted with this and came along and said, all right, we will provide the funds to fix this, but, there's a big but you are going to hand over the car keys in return. And so since 1980, folks, Central Park has not been run by the city government, but by a private conservancy. They do all the maintenance, they keep order, they do all the rich programming, and it's been a spectacular success. Visitation to the park has grown from 12 million in the year that the charitable group took over to more than 40 million today. And in a similar way, I don't know if you realize that nearly all, and I mean all, of the successful education reforms of the last generation were sparked and fueled by philanthropy. I don't know if you realize that private donors are behind a huge portion of today's medical breakthroughs, or that voluntary gifts to the arts are now 5 to 10 times the size of government support. Do you know that U.S. philanthropy is important in all kinds of areas and niches you might never expect? For instance, the recovery of endangered species, or even national defense. I'm about to do some overseas touring next month of very important work being done by charities in places like Kurdistan and Serbia and Georgia. Let's take just a quick number to look at some of the brute numbers. Jim mentioned our charitable sector is big. 10% of our workforce now is employed in the charitable sector, and Americans voluntarily give away every single year $428 billion. And then there's the volunteer time that we give away. If you put a reasonable dollar value on our volunteer hours, you roughly double that total giving. So folks, we are talking here about close to $1 trillion a year annual industry. So just in brute economic terms, it's non-trivial. And there's, of course, much, much more to philanthropy's power than just the dollar volume. The way that philanthropy attacks problems and the way that government approaches problems are very different. One way to view the contrast between government spending and philanthropic spending, I suggest, is to view philanthropy as venture capital, all right? Whereas government spending is more like working capital. All right? Now, working capital is important too. It pays the light bill in the factory. Venture capital will build you a brand new factory, ideally one that doesn't include lights, doesn't need lights. Now, when you are spending venture capital, you're going to be surprised often, and you know that you're going to fail frequently too, because you're experimenting. Right? You're trying things that have never been attempted before. But when you do hit home, the payoff is large. And all of society enjoys deep benefits. So philanthropy is much more inventive than government spending, and it is much nimbler at adapting to changing conditions, and it's also far more efficient. A meta-study a few years ago compared 71 different instances where the authors were able to find the same basic social service being provided by a public agency and simultaneously by a philanthropic organization. And they found that in 56 out of the 71 cases, the philanthropic provider was more cost-effective. In 10 cases, there was no clear difference, and in only 5 cases was the public provider more efficient. Philanthropy's strengths of the sorts I've just been describing here are very visible, mind you, to everyday Americans. They're pretty aware of this. In 2015, I commissioned a poll of a national sample of US voters, and one of the questions asks, quote, would your first choice for solving a social problem in America be to use the government or to use philanthropic aid? And 6 out of 10 Americans with an opinion said use philanthropic aid. Another question asked, when it comes to addressing the most pressing issues of our day, which social sector do you trust the most? Entrepreneurial companies, nonprofit charities, or government agencies? And only 16% trusted government agencies most. 33%, as you can see there, preferred entrepreneurial companies. And 50% said that they trust solutions from charities most. Now, I suspect in your heart of hearts, many of you already understood much of what I've just been pointing out to you about the efficacy of philanthropy. But now I want to make an argument that I think will be less obvious. I want to suggest that quite apart from its usefulness in solving social problems, philanthropic activity has a giant political importance in our country. You know, democracy is not a spectator sport, all right? Democracy works only if citizens participate, and specifically if they wield authority themselves, rather than simply being, you know, the subject of somebody else's authority. Our independent sector of millions of active charities allows citizens to take serious, direct action to improve their communities, to engage on topics that concern them most by the methods that they think are smartest, and to make an immediate difference in the lives and events that are unfolding all around them. And they can do all this without asking anybody's permission. Just jump in and do it. And civil society in this way has profound effects, I think, in protecting the legitimacy of democracy in modern countries, because it preserves a sense of personal agency, all right? And it protects the reality of self-governance at a time when a lot of us feel like we are little ants on a very, very big beast that's moving in its own direction under its own momentum. Unfortunately, this freedom-enhancing philanthropic tradition is under serious attack today in the United States. And that's mostly a side effect of the, I guess you'd call it a race today, the current race among journalists and academics and politicians of the left to outdo each other in expressing suspicion for capitalism and business and personal wealth. As part of this new surge of thundering against the rich, there are now attacks even on people who are earnestly trying to give away large sums of money. These are some of the most recent books that have been published about philanthropy. All of these have come out over the last year or so. And let me just read you some of the cover lines from these books. Philanthropy does more harm than good. Giving back disguises merciless taking. Generosity has become the wingman of injustice and rigging of our system. And philanthropy is damaging democracy. It's increasingly common to caricature philanthropy as a tool that crafty plutocrats, very crafty plutocrats, are using to deceive and manipulate the rest of us. Critics say that even well-intentioned charitable efforts are ultimately undemocratic. There's a stunning essay or item from the editors of the New York Times this spring where they argued that only the government should be allowed to improve public welfare. It's undemocratic for anyone else to get involved. And alternatives to state power should actually be shut down, they suggested, by taking away the personal wealth that fuels private giving. So I want to address that issue frontally. Are donors really hijacking democracy? It's a serious question. And does private giving represent a dangerous concentration of power? The evidence says no. Let me start with the 800-pound gorilla of philanthropy. I think most of you know this is the biggest giver in the world. Bill Gates. The Gates Foundation gives away about $5 billion every year, all right, to a variety of causes. Sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But let's put that in context. As Jim and I have told you, Americans as a whole give away close to $1 trillion annually in a combination of cash and volunteer time. That means, just do the math on that, a lot of math people in this room I know, that means that the single biggest player in philanthropy, all right, the head honcho of the Billionaire Boys Club is wielding a market share of 1/2 of 1%. Right? His giving represents 0.5% of all the giving in this country. That is not a dangerous overconcentration of power, folks. The truth is that moguls put up only a small portion of America's total giving. Jim referred to these numbers too. Let me give you the exact numbers. This is from the latest data that came out in June. Even if you ignore the value of the volunteer time that I've talked about and you look just at cash, this is cash only that I'm depicting here, only 18% of US private giving today comes from foundations that were started by the wealthy. The much, much larger piece comes from individuals. And that $8 out of $10 that gets given away by individuals is dominated by everyday donors who give about $3,000 a year. Now, there's some people who say, oh, you can't change the world with $3,000. That's kind of trivial, isn't it? Well, you do the math for me. $3,000 times 100 million households. It's a very, very big number. And, you know, the media can only talk about the Gateses and Zuckerbergs of the world. But they are only the tiny tip of the iceberg. The much bigger mass looming beneath the surface are our everyday givers. America's charitable sector is actually one of the most pluralistic and democratic parts of our society. There are more than 100 million donors in the US in a given year, as I just mentioned. There are 77 million annual volunteers, right? And there are approaching 2 million independent, privately supported charitable foundations. These millions of givers and millions of charities, they're kind of a huge matrix, right? There's a huge diffuse matrix which defines, collectively, they define social ills, the ones that we're most concerned about, and then they marshal resources very methodically to attack those problems at a local level. And I want to suggest you think of these charitable entities as a kind of massive legislature, all right? That's really what this is. These many charitable efforts are a kind of a spontaneous legislature with millions of members that crowdfunds what it cares about, all right? Without asking the permission of elites. Now, admirers of participatory democracy, it seems to me, ought to be thrilled by these mass, small-scale actions, and smart people are. I mean, Yale law professor Stephen Carter points out that, quote, every donor measures the needs of the community with different calipers. I like his phrasing there. So the result is you get a highly pluralistic version of what Carter calls democracy in action. The independent, radically decentralized problem solving that is carried out by philanthropy is actually a superb way of protecting minority views, all right? Of letting, you know, non-mainstream and even unpopular ideas have their day in the sun. Much, much less orthodoxy or enforced groupthink when the production of public goods is divided into millions of little experiments instead of a single government path. Now, that produces a crazy quilt, all right? You got 1 million people trying to solve problems in their own ways. And that causes, shall we say, severe brain cramps in some observers. You've probably heard this, and there are people who say, oh, that's way too anarchic. That's too uncontrolled. That's too homemade, the charitable solutions. And these folks insist that, you know, if you have a large-scale problem, you need a large-scale solution. I bet you've all heard that. I know I've heard it 1 million times. These critics want credentialed elites in charge. Right? It absolutely drives them nuts that this mix of, you know, little old church ladies and businessmen who made a lot of money selling chicken sandwiches and tech investors who want to attack poverty like a startup, that freaks out someone with a Prussian mind. Can't deal with that. But I am here to tell you that the drumbeat you hear from the left today, insisting on large, uniform social solutions, Medicare for all, blah, 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 that is completely retrograde. That could not be more crazy and reactionary. Among other proofs, the information revolution demonstrated that crystal clear a long time ago. You know, in the beginning, computers were big centralized devices like this one, and we learned this is a lousy way to solve problems. If you want to solve complex problems, what you want is this. This is a computer hackathon. And letting thousands of independent actors chip away at different aspects of a challenge, we learned, is a much more effective way of solving complex problems. This obviously is how the internet was built, all right? The internet wasn't built by any big corporation or agency or anything. It was built by millions of participants doing their little bit. And ultimately, they created a huge, powerful mosaic. And that pattern of lots of small contributors working independently without direction, which is sometimes called distributed intelligence, that is not just the story of the internet. That's very common to lots of technology and biology and human history, and it is the secret behind the success of philanthropic solutions. Let me close now with one final point, which is that government and charity are often competitors, all right? They operate in many of the same arenas, and some people argue that it's disruptive or even illegitimate for civil society groups to compete with the state. You can see here some teachers going wild about charter schools. Government employee unions, agency heads, and of course all their academic and journalistic apologists absolutely kick and scream whenever social authority and resources migrate away from state bureaus and into independent organizations like charter schools or Catholic schools or churches or private medical aid or charitable alternatives for the poor. Politicians are often, in the best cases, blind to the power and productivity of civil society, and in the worst cases, actively hostile. And they often have a very exaggerated understanding of their own role in enhancing the country. Quote, every single great idea that has marked the 21st century, the 20th century, and the 19th century has required government vision and government incentive. That was, as you can see, Vice President Joe Biden a few years ago. Or the ballot box is the place where all change begins in America. So claimed Senator Ted Kennedy at the peak of his powers. Both of those claims, folks, are absolutely erroneous, as I explained with hundreds of examples in the Almanac of American Philanthropy. There's lots of examples here. I talk about the revulsion against slavery. I talk about where did the greatest advancements in education come from. Those sorts of things, ballot boxes actually, and government had surprisingly little to do with many of those climactic shifts in American history. But you would never know that from elite discussion. Journalists and academics and public officials devote 90% of their time to talking about the 10% of our lives where politics and government predominate. And meanwhile, there's hardly any conversation at all about the huge swath of our existence where the real influences on the quality of your life are, your community fabric and your family health and the connections you have to neighbors and your faith and church activity and your personal relationships, your voluntary enthusiasms. So the result is that we are really misunderstanding ourselves. We overlook the factors that are most important to our success and happiness, and we misunderstand the big picture. The truth is today that Americans live in a reasonably healthy and robust society where many issues get addressed by independent problem solvers before they even rise to the level of national attention. Our agencies of government are often disappointing, all right? And as a result, we imagine that our whole culture is languishing. That's not accurate. In reality, we are coping and adjusting and solving problems pretty well, but you have to look beyond government to recognize that. So with that, I will thank you for your attention.